Why did a young Marine suddenly stop when he saw an old man eating alone by the door? For years, that man returned to the same booth every Memorial Day, unnoticed, unspoken, forgotten. Most thought he was just another quiet customer. But one scar revealed a story the world had almost erased. What followed stirred an entire town and brought a forgotten past back into the light. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why one look changed everything. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that deserve to be remembered. The winter morning in the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina arrived colder than usual. The sky was a dull shade of gray, heavy and unmoving, like a wool blanket stretched across the heavens. Frost clung to the pavement, glinting faintly under the weak light of a sun that hadn't quite committed to rising. A slow wind slipped through the narrow streets, curling around street signs and rattling the brittle branches of bare trees. Inside a small diner named Jenny's Corner, warmth radiated from every surface. Wooden panels lined the walls, their varnish worn but well kept. The scent of bacon and fresh biscuits mingled with the occasional hiss of the coffee machine and the clinking of ceramic plates. Booths and bar stools were nearly full, families in layered coats, elderly couples holding hands, and solitary regulars clutching steaming mugs. Conversations flowed with the rhythm of routine, murmurs of politics, weather updates, and weekend discounts at the local mall. At the far end of the room, near a drafty window rimmed with frost, sat an elderly man. His name was Roy Miller. He was thin, his shoulders narrow beneath a faded olive jacket that had lost the sharpness of its seams long ago. His features were angular, marked by a lifetime of sun and silence. His hands, veined and steady, moved with deliberate care as he guided a fork through scrambled eggs that had already begun to cool. On his left wrist, just barely visible beneath his sleeve, rested a scar, an 8-pointed star, pale and irregular, as though carved with something crude and permanent. It looked old, worn down by time, but unmistakable. It wasn't art. It was something else, something that no one in the diner ever asked about. Roy didn't speak. He never did. He ordered the same meal every year on the same day. Memorial Day breakfast, no substitutions. Scrambled eggs, 2 slices of dry toast, and black coffee. He always arrived just after opening and left before the main rush, avoiding eye contact and interaction. The waitstaff recognized him, but their exchanges were limited to nods and the sound of ceramic on formica. There were whispers among them, of course, speculations about his past, about what that scar meant, but no one ever asked. No one ever truly knew. The seat he chose was always the same, the corner booth where the light barely touched the tabletop, and the noise from the jukebox softened into a low hum. It was a booth meant for 4, but no one dared share it. His presence made it sacred in an unspoken way. Even the regulars knew to leave it alone. He ate slowly, not because he lacked the strength, but because he saw no reason to hurry. His eyes wandered sometimes to the window, where the world outside moved without urgency. A jogger passing by, a delivery truck reversing, a child in a puffy jacket hopping over patches of ice. But mostly his gaze stayed low, fixed on his plate or the hands in his lap. There was something solemn about his routine, something ritualistic, as though this meal was less about nourishment and more about honoring a memory. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, folded it neatly, and set it beside his plate. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a $1 bill, creased and softened at the corners. He placed it under the edge of his saucer, adjusted his jacket collar, and sat for a moment longer, hands clasped gently on the table. Then he stood, with the aid of a cane that had been leaning against the bench. His movement was slow, measured, and without complaint. As he walked toward the door, the bell above it jingled softly. The cold air rushed in, and the sound of it mingled with the sudden hush that seemed to follow him out. The door closed and life inside the diner resumed. Plates clinked, coffee was poured, and the morning regained its rhythm. But his booth remained empty, a quiet vacancy amid the warmth. The waitress who'd served him that morning paused as she passed the table. She looked down at the empty seat, then at the folded napkin and dollar bill. Without a word, she straightened the salt shaker and moved on, as if something sacred had just happened and should be left untouched. At the counter near the front window, 2 men in their early 40s sat sipping coffee and checking their phones between bites of cinnamon rolls. They wore matching windbreakers with a local insurance company logo embroidered on the chest, the kind of attire that announced weekday routine and small-town predictability. They came in often, always loud enough to be noticed, but not so much to be considered disruptive. That morning, as they chatted about college football and office gossip, their attention drifted toward the far corner of the diner. One of them nudged the other and tilted his chin toward the booth near the window where Roy Miller sat. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. His companion followed his gaze, raised his eyebrows, and leaned in. What began as a whisper between two bored professionals quickly evolved into louder, less guarded remarks. They spoke with the offhand confidence of those who rarely consider the weight of their words. Questions spilled out, half joking, half skeptical, about old men clinging to stories, about scars no one could verify, about people who dressed like veterans but offered no proof. Their conversation wasn't laced with cruelty, but it carried a kind of dismissive ignorance that was more cutting in its casualness. It didn't take long for their voices to carry beyond their immediate space. The hum of the diner dulled slightly as nearby patrons caught fragments of their remarks. No one spoke up, but a few glanced over toward Roy. He hadn't moved. He remained seated, eyes low, hands steady. If he heard them, he gave no indication. His fork continued to pass slowly through his food. Behind the counter, Kate stood with a glass coffee pot in one hand and a stack of clean mugs in the other. She was 22, a part-time waitress and full-time student, saving for nursing school. This was her third shift of the week, and until that moment, the morning had been quiet. But the shift in tone was palpable. She froze in place, her eyes shifting from the two men to Roy, then back again. Her instinct was to do something, to say something, but uncertainty kept her rooted. She wasn't sure what would be appropriate or safe. Moments later, the manager emerged from the back office. His name was Darren, a meticulous man in his late 30s, with a clipped beard and a preference for crisp collars and tight schedules. He didn't linger long in the dining area unless something required attention. The soft murmur of discomfort must have reached his office, because he stepped out with a notepad tucked under one arm and a rehearsed expression of concern. He scanned the room, his eyes settling on Roy's booth. Without hesitation, he walked over, weaving around tables with the poise of someone used to navigating close quarters. He stopped at the edge of Roy's table and leaned in slightly. His voice was low, composed, practiced. Whatever he said, it was intended to sound polite, almost apologetic, but his posture was firm, his message clear. A request, not a demand, but not optional either. Roy looked up just long enough to meet Darren's eyes. Then slowly he nodded. It wasn't a nod of agreement or understanding. It was the nod of someone who had heard this before, who no longer felt the need to ask why. With quiet precision, Roy set down his fork, folded his napkin, and reached for his cane. He stood balancing himself with familiar care, then lifted his tray. Each step toward the door was slow, deliberate. The rubber tip of the cane tapped gently against the tile floor, a rhythmic sound that echoed louder than it should have. His shoulders were drawn inward, his gait slightly uneven. A few patrons shifted in their seats, pretending to look elsewhere, their discomfort growing more visible the longer he walked. No one offered to help. No one met his eyes. He reached a smaller table near the entrance, close to the coat rack and the drafty doorway that led outside. It was a two-seater, pushed slightly away from the others, less inviting, more functional. He placed his tray down, adjusted his chair, and sat without a word. The noise of the diner resumed, dampened, a bit more careful. Conversations picked up again, though more subdued than before. The insurance men at the counter returned to their coffee, their expressions unreadable. Kate slowly resumed her movement behind the counter, heart still quick, unsure if what had just happened was finished or only beginning. No one acknowledged Roy's relocation. Even those who knew him best chose silence over solidarity. In that moment, it wasn't just the cold air near the door that made his new seat feel distant. It was the weight of a room that had decided to look away. Roughly 20 minutes had passed since Roy had been asked to move. The air inside the diner had regained some of its previous rhythm, though the unease lingered faintly like a draft beneath the door. Plates clinked, coffee refilled, and conversation trickled on, but softer now, as though the earlier moment had left behind a delicate crack in the room's foundation. The front door opened with a metallic chime, letting in a burst of cold air that curled along the floor. A man stepped inside, tall and sharp-edged, wearing a neatly pressed military uniform that carried with it the unspoken weight of discipline and command. His boots made no sound as he crossed the threshold, but his presence shifted the balance of the room immediately. Conversations faltered, heads turned subtly. A pause moved through the diner like a ripple through still water. His name was Jason Bradley. He was in his late 20s, a lieutenant in the Navy, recently rotated stateside and taking leave to visit his parents in Asheville. His posture was exact, not stiff but precise, every movement measured, every breath considered. His jaw was square, clean-shaven, his eyes alert but calm. He did not look around the room for a place to sit or a familiar face to greet. His gaze locked almost instantly on the man seated at the table near the door. He saw the scar before he saw the man. That small detail, a faded, eight-pointed star carved into the wrist of someone old enough to be his grandfather, caught him like a wire to the chest. Jason froze, his expression unreadable. Then he took a single step forward, then another, each one drawing him closer to the figure seated alone with a half-eaten plate and a full cup of coffee growing cold by the minute. Roy hadn't noticed him yet. He was still hunched slightly, hands resting near his plate, eyes fixed downward. But Jason recognized him. Not by face, not by name, but by mark. That scar was more than a remnant. It was a relic, a symbol passed in whispers through the ranks of a generation that followed. It belonged to a group that was never mentioned in official documents, whose missions were carried out in silence and whose records, if they existed at all, were sealed and buried. Jason reached the table and stopped, standing still as though crossing an invisible threshold. His back straightened further. His boots remained locked in place, heels firm against the floor. The diner grew quieter with each passing second. Even the sound of the coffee machine seemed to die down, as if the room itself recognized that something significant was happening. He didn't speak. He didn't make a gesture. He simply stood there, fixed in place, his eyes on Roy with a gaze that carried reverence and certainty. It was not curiosity that brought him to the table. It was understanding. Roy lifted his head slowly, his brow furrowed with mild confusion, and met the eyes of the younger man. Something subtle passed between them, an acknowledgement, a memory neither had shared but both somehow carried. Jason remained still until that connection was confirmed. Only then did he move again, lowering himself carefully into the seat across from Roy, like a student stepping into a long-forgotten classroom. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The uniform had already spoken. The scar had already answered. They sat in silence, a still frame in the midst of a moving world. Around them, the diner paused once more. Customers stared over their cups. Staff froze mid-step. The two men, one old, one young, became a gravity well that drew every eye, every thought. Kate stood behind the counter, her heart racing for reasons she didn't fully understand. She didn't know who the younger man was, but she felt the weight in the air shift the moment he walked in. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, the kind that bypasses logic and roots itself deep in instinct. Something important had just happened, and even without context, everyone in the diner felt it. Time didn't stop, but it slowed. The image of them sitting together, the old man in a worn jacket and the young soldier in full dress, etched itself into the memory of the room. Whatever this was, an act of respect, a moment of discovery, it didn't need explanation. It only needed silence. Later that same day, after her shift had ended and the dishes had been stacked and dried, Kate sat in her mother's kitchen sipping tea with trembling hands. The encounter between the old man and the young soldier lingered in her mind, vivid and heavy. She recounted it slowly, uncertain of what it meant, but sure that it had meant something. Her mother listened carefully, said little, then quietly picked up her phone and typed out a post in the local community group online. She included a single photo Kate had managed to take with her phone, more instinct than intention. It showed the two men seated across from each other, neither speaking, both still. The older man's wrist rested against the edge of the table, scar faint but visible. The soldier's uniform was crisp, his posture reverent. The image was grainy and dimly lit, but it captured something deeper than clarity. It captured truth. The caption beneath the post was simple. No names, no embellishment, no call to action. Just a line that read, "Some heroes go unseen, but not forever." The post spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, it had been shared dozens of times. By the next morning, it had traveled far beyond the boundaries of Asheville. Strangers commented with words of thanks. Others shared stories of their own grandfathers, uncles, brothers, men who had served and slipped into silence. Veterans from across the state began tagging one another, asking if they recognized the face, the scar, the gesture. By the following day, a reporter from the local news station arrived at Jenny's corner with a cameraman. They spoke to the staff, to Kate, to a few regulars who had been there that morning. Their segment aired that night, and within 24 hours, more media followed. Regional outlets picked up the story. News trucks began to appear intermittently outside the small diner, sometimes idling for hours just to catch a glimpse of the man in the photo. Most days they left with only shots of an empty booth and the murmurs of those who had seen him. The town, once indifferent to the man who came in quietly every Memorial Day, began to shift in tone. A bouquet of wildflowers appeared at the edge of his usual table, wrapped in plain paper with a single handwritten note, "For what you carried." Then came the letters. Some were handwritten on lined paper, others typed and sealed in formal envelopes. They came from veterans, from widows, from children whose parents had served and never returned. Some told stories of battles survived. Others simply expressed gratitude. A few enclosed photographs, yellowed and creased, of squads long gone and smiles long faded. One morning, Kate found a thick, leather-bound book placed neatly at Roy's table. Inside was a list of names, alphabetically arranged with dates and ranks. At the front was a note that read, "We remember because you did." No one claimed authorship. It had simply appeared. People began to behave differently. The seat across from Roy was no longer considered an empty chair. It became a place of quiet honor. A few older men, their own bodies bent with time, would come in and sit for a moment or two without ordering anything. Some brought their grandchildren, others brought nothing at all except silence. They didn't ask Roy questions. They just sat, as if to say, "We know." Even the tone of the diner changed. The conversations became softer. The regulars paid closer attention to the world around them. The two men from the insurance company who had once whispered from the counter stopped coming altogether. No one missed them. The owner of Jenny's Corner, a woman named Margaret who rarely came out of her office, had a small brass plaque commissioned. It was discreet, no larger than a business card, and it was fastened to the edge of Roy's table without fanfare. It read simply, "Reserved with gratitude." Word continued to spread. Emails arrived from out of state. A few were from historians curious about the scar, asking if anyone knew more about the unit associated with the mark. Most were met with polite declines. No one gave out Roy's full name, not because they didn't know it, but because they felt, instinctively, that he hadn't wanted it spoken. It wasn't about identity. It was about presence. And in that presence, the town began to see itself differently. Roy never sought attention. He returned to Jenny's Corner as if nothing had changed. His steps were the same, his expression as composed and distant as always. But something had shifted around him. His usual booth was no longer simply a seat by the window. It had become sacred space. No one asked, no sign was needed. Patrons simply knew not to sit there. It remained untouched, a silent tribute shaped by mutual understanding. His order never varied. Oatmeal, toast, and black coffee. No cream, no sugar, no substitutions. He ate quietly, without rush, often before the main crowd arrived. The waitstaff learned his rhythm, timing his meal so that it was always warm and ready when he came in. They never hovered, never asked questions. The conversations that had once flowed freely near his booth now softened into respectful murmurs. Outside of the diner, Roy's life remained unadorned. His auto repair shop, tucked away on a side street lined with maples, had been a quiet fixture in Asheville for 3 decades. Its wooden sign, faded from sun and rain, simply read, "Roy's Garage." For years it had seen only a trickle of loyal customers, older locals, veterans, and those who remembered a time before everything became disposable. But after the photograph circulated and the story began to echo beyond town lines, the garage saw a change. People stopped by not because their vehicles needed work, but because they wanted to meet him. Some came to shake his hand. Others left tokens, a patch from an old uniform, a folded flag, a handwritten note. School children from the local elementary brought crayon drawings of soldiers and stars, often with crooked handwriting and misspelled words that made Roy's expression soften, just slightly. He never turned them away. He didn't say much, but he listened. Sometimes he nodded. Occasionally, if a visitor lingered long enough, he would reach into a drawer and pull out an old oil-stained photograph, men in muddy fatigues standing beside a truck with blank expressions and tired eyes. He never explained who they were. He didn't have to. The garage remained simple. No renovations, no updates. The floor was cracked in places and the walls bore the smudges of time, but the benches were always clean, the tools lined up with quiet precision. Roy still worked every day, though slower now, often taking longer breaks between jobs. He declined offers of help, especially from those who came with cameras or business cards. The city council approached him about installing a commemorative plaque on the front of the diner or on the side of his shop. They had plans drawn, with official emblems and engraved inscriptions. Roy politely declined. He didn't want a plaque. He didn't want his name on anything. Recognition made him uneasy. Gratitude, he believed, belonged to others. But one morning, just after sunrise, Roy arrived at the garage to find something new. Fastened to the front door with two small brass screws was a metal star. 8 points, simple, unpainted. It was nearly identical to the scar on his wrist. There was no note, no signature, just the symbol, silent, intentional. He stood before it for a long time. He didn't touch it. He didn't remove it. He simply unlocked the door and went inside, flicked on the light, and began his day. From then on, the star remained. And though no one ever spoke of it, every person who visited noticed. Some paused before entering. Others reached up to touch it lightly, like a ritual. It had become a quiet emblem, not just of Roy, but of everything he stood for. In time, the star began to gather a subtle sheen from countless hands. But Roy never commented. He continued as he always had, with steady hands and few words, surrounded by memories that spoke louder than any tribute. In early spring, Roy turned 90. The season was slow to bloom that year. The trees hesitated to bud, and the morning still carried the chill of late winter. Roy continued to visit his garage most days, moving slower now, resting more often between repairs. His hands, though aged, still gripped tools with the familiarity of repetition. He no longer took new customers, but the garage remained open. He kept the lights on, the radio low, and the doors unlocked as he always had. On the morning of his birthday, the diner felt off. Kate noticed first. It was past the time he usually arrived, and his booth by the window remained empty. His coffee had been poured and set down out of habit. She waited another 10 minutes, then stepped into the back and tried calling him. The phone rang several times, then fell silent. She tried again. No answer. Later that day, a longtime neighbor noticed Roy's garage door still shut by noon. Concerned, he walked around the side entrance, knocked gently, then pushed the door open. The lights were on. The room smelled faintly of oil and dust. Roy was there, seated in his old chair near the workbench, his head resting slightly to the side. In one hand, he held a screwdriver. In the other, lay a folded black and white photo, faded but still clear. A group of soldiers, young and tired, stood together beside a rusted military truck. Roy was among them. He had passed quietly, no struggle, no sign of distress. He had simply slipped away, surrounded by the sounds, scents, and symbols of the life he had lived. There was a stillness in the garage that day, a kind of peace that spoke louder than grief. Word traveled quickly. The town moved with a quiet coordination, as if everyone already knew what needed to be done. The funeral was held 3 days later in a small white church near the edge of Asheville. The pews were filled long before the service began. People stood along the walls, spilled into the aisles, and gathered on the lawn outside. They came in uniforms and overalls, with medals and tool belts, with flowers and folded notes. 6 active-duty service members carried Roy's casket. Jason Bradley was among them, his uniform pressed, his movement steady. He did not speak. None of them did. The silence was their tribute. At the cemetery, beneath the shadow of a tree just beginning to bloom, the casket was lowered into the ground with the precision of a final mission completed. There was no eulogy, no slideshow, no procession of speakers. The headstone was modest, etched with a name, 2 dates, and a single line beneath. He served quietly. He helped many. He remained himself. There was nothing more to say. The following morning, the diner reopened with a new sign above the door. It read, Roy's Table. No ribbon-cutting ceremony was held, no mayoral speech or press release. The change had been made unanimously without debate. Inside, his usual booth remained untouched. The brass plaque that had once simply read, Reserved with Gratitude, was replaced with a new one, freshly polished. It read, In memory of those who spoke through action. People continued to sit in the booth, but not alone. It became a table for veterans, for quiet conversations, for moments when words weren't needed. Tourists often asked who Roy was. The regulars would nod toward the window and say, He's still here. Over time, the town folded his memory into its fabric, not as a relic, but as a presence. His garage remained, its door repainted but still bearing the metal star. Children passed it on their way to school, pointing it out to friends like it was a landmark. Veterans placed their hands on it when they walked by. No one explained why. They just knew.